Hi, this is Julie Chavanaugh with Yoga Trainers Tribe, Yoga Trainers Workshop, all those yoga trainers titles. And I'm here today training on steps 3 and 4 for my 8 steps for planning your yoga teacher training. So all of this is part of a downloadable roadmap that I have. It's called the Yoga Trainers Roadmap, and you can get that. That link is at the top in the announcements on the page, so you can get that there and follow along. So feel free to do that. Today are steps 3 and 4. We covered some other steps last time. My hope is that by learning these steps, you have a step-by-step process for communicating your training with your students and those in your community, a plan for having a way to actually train them, right? So having that organized steps for training them, what they're there to do, and that you'll be able to prepare and improve for next time. So all of those are reasons why I created these eight steps. I have found over the years that when I am planning for training, these are a lot of the things that I consider, a lot of the steps that I go through. And so I wanted to share them with you. I'm just making sure that I have everything here before I get started. Okay, so again, I created these steps because planning training for me when I first started felt very daunting. As I went through my first session, I knew I needed to be more organized. There were a lot of things that tripped me up that first session, and I knew I needed to have a better process for creating these materials and for really planning for what I was going to do at training. And so that's where this 8-step process came in. That's what I work with people on, and that's the training actually that we're going through here over these next few weeks. So step 1 was finding your training's voice. That is very crucial, right? To figure out what makes your teaching, your studio unique to you and to your studio, right? What unique perspectives do you bring? What other things do you offer at your yoga studio? It seems like there are a lot of studios that are much more eclectic these days compared to 20 years ago when I started practicing yoga. And that's amazing because I think we can all learn from a variety of things in a variety of places. So what is it that makes your studio and your teaching unique? What is it that you are not? So we talked about that last time, and that's a tough step to take because we don't want to exclude anything. But what is it that you are not a specialist in? What is it that you're not going to cover at your training? And I think that's an important thing to have in the back of your head as you try to create what you're going to communicate is really narrowing that down to make it simple and easy to understand for those of the people in your community. And then 2 was defining your structure. And this was about, are you going to do weekdays or weekends? Will you have, what staff will you have? What guest instructors will you have? How will you structure your hours to meet those Yoga Alliance requirements if you are registering as a Yoga Alliance school? So all of those things are kind of the organizing the structure of your training. So, you might say, I'm going to meet from March to November because those are the months that work for my studio. Otherwise, we've got holiday things going on and beginning of year and it's too chaotic. So those are the months I'm going to narrow it down to. And then you start to kind of hone in from there. And step 3 that we are covering today talks exactly about that. So now that you've got a structure, you've got some ideas of the staff, other staff and instructors that are going to help you, perhaps some of your guest instructors. Now we are going to start talking about chunking this down even further. So we started at the 10,000 foot level, right, with the structure of your training, what weekends you'll meet, or if you'll meet weekends or weekdays. You've kind of got an idea of how to structure those blocks of time to meet the Yoga Alliance contact hour requirements. That's all shifting in February, but for some of you who are already registered, that will still be the case for another year. So that's kind of the way we're looking at it at this point. So you've got your overall agenda. You'll need to, once you've figured out which months you will be working with, perhaps the time blocks you'll be working with. Step 3, you start to narrow down what topics you're going to be covering at those trainings. So, for instance, are you going to be covering at your first training anatomy? Are you going to, what months is anatomy going to be covered? What months are you going to cover history? What months or weekends or segments will you cover lifestyle, ethics, all of those kinds of higher level questions that you need to answer when you start to create, we're going to work down to creating a daily agenda, right? So, you need to start from that higher level and figure out when are the big chunks of time, when are the big topics going to be scheduled in what order for your training. And that will help you then come down to the next level of a weekend agenda and a daily agenda. I say weekend because a lot of trainings these days are over the weekends. They are a Friday night, a Saturday, Sunday. I've seen trainings that have a Wednesday night, a Saturday, and a Sunday. It just all depends. I have seen a few, as I talked the last time, that are during the week, during the weekdays. Everybody's demographics, everybody's market is a little different, so you need to think about your market and your demographics, and that will help you determine what days and that kind of thing. So once you've got that, then you can come down. We're talking about your daily agenda and how you're going to have that structured. One way I do this is that I figure out, so if I know that my first month of training, this isn't really how I do it, but I'm just an example here. My first month of training is going to be anatomy. Right? So I know that I need to have a certain number of hours of anatomy for the Yoga Alliance requirements, and I've got the topics that I want to cover. The next thing it'll help me create my daily agenda is what activities am I doing? Well, I'm probably going to be doing some reading and discussion, right? My trainees, if I've got either a manual and workbook, which is what I work from, or segments of my favorite books or blogs and resources online. I've got those. I've started to organize that information as I pull together. Now I figure out I'm going to do reading. We will probably do some workbook stuff. So they're, kind of a review of what we've read and discussed. May cover a few postures as we talk about different muscles. I'm probably going to do some meditation practices, journaling, and am I going to have a guest teacher for this segment? So once I figure out those details, then I start to say, okay, what will I specifically do on Friday night, for instance, from 6 to 9? And what will I do on Saturday between noon and 2, 2 and 4, 4 and 6? So then I can start to say, okay, on Friday we're going to start with our reading. We're going to get through all of our reading and have that good chunk of material read through together. That's going to generate some conversation that may lead into Saturday. So I may have some structured questions that I want to discuss with the trainees. So that's what we're going to cover first. Then we're going to go to the workbook, and I'm guessing it's going to take us a half an hour to get through the workbook and answer more questions. So you see, I can figure out how much time different things are going to take me. One note about planning time is that it will change. What I have found is that it's very different when I have a handful of trainees in a small group versus a large group of trainees. For one, there are far more questions to address, right? There are far more questions from a larger group than a smaller group. Sometimes the discussions are great in the small group, though. Don't get me wrong, because those conversations people can feel more comfortable. So, but Typically, some of these things take longer with a bigger group because you've got more questions to answer. So you've got to account for that every time you plan your agenda. Let's see here. I do use, as I mentioned, a manual and workbook that I created for training. Of course, I offer those, but if you are putting together your own materials, if you're pulling from certain books, if you are creating a manual, a workbook, worksheets, this is where you're going to start pulling those things together and getting very specific. Okay, out of my teaching yoga book, I'm going to draw from pages 50 to 56. You read through those, you figure out, what your trainees are going to read, what are the important parts from your perspective as the trainer, and then, all of that starts to narrow down specifically what you're going to be covering in your daily agenda. I'm going to include in the comments a very simple daily agenda format that I use in my training. It looks very simple, but I will tell you, it helps me get my head around what I'm going to be doing in each of our meetings. And it really makes me figure out, okay, will this take an hour and a half, or will this take 2 hours, or will it take an hour? And sort of coming down to that level of detail. So that's the level of detail you're getting to. Step 2, you're still at 10,000 feet. Step 3, you start at about 5,000, right? And you're working your way down to those daily agendas. All of these steps 1 through 8 that we're going to cover are really geared to making your training great, right? This next step we're going to talk to, step 4, is really a key step as well. But all of these steps, you want to create a training that gives trainees what they came for, why they signed up for your training. They came to learn how to teach yoga classes. So you want to give them what they came for, because in turn that builds your training's reputation, right? That makes people want to come to your training if they know that you've got your act together and are well thought out in how you're both preparing and presenting your materials. That goes a long way to building your school's reputation. And the bonus, I always talk about the bonus, is as a trainer, it is extremely beneficial to you. 1, you are much more calm. I know I am when I've got my agenda and I know what I'm covering and I've got my things earmarked. It also, it just makes the whole training better. You're more calm, you have more fun, and you will pay attention to what the trainees are asking for. As you go through, as we get to step 8, we're going to talk about preparing for next time, and that's something that you're thinking about all of the time. But when you've got an agenda, you can stay very present. When I'm in training and I have an agenda and I know that from 12 to 2 I've allotted time for a conversation about anatomy, I don't feel like I'm constantly checking my clock to make sure we're not running over. I know that I'm going to cover everything I need to cover, and in the time allotted, because I can keep an eye on my time and my allotted time and what I've got planned. There is obviously flexibility, right? It's something that you thought would take till 2 may only take until 1:30, and that happens. But then at 4 o'clock, you may run into something that takes longer. So there is flexibility, but having that daily agenda is crucial to making the whole thing run so much smoother. So, okay, so that's step number 3, is getting your daily agenda. As I said, I'm going to post this so that you can download your own copy of this and have something to start from when you're creating your daily agenda. Step 4 is preparing yourself as a trainer, right? So preparing yourself so I toy with the idea of moving this to step number 1, quite honestly, because really a lot of this is a foundational piece. It's really important if you want a program with longevity, with a good reputation. You need to prepare yourself to being a trainer. And I get some confused looks about this one. People are like, what? I already teach classes. I teach 10 classes a week. I teach 15 classes a week. How can it be that much different? I'm constantly talking and interacting with people. It is vastly different. And so I ask you to just take a moment to understand that it is very different. When I started, and part of the reason I emphasize this in my planning is when I started, I greatly underestimated the difference between teaching and training. I was in the same boat. I was like, I'm running my studio, I'm interacting with students all day, all the time. How can it be that much different? And really, honestly, what threw me for the biggest loop was the conversation. When I'm teaching classes, just like I'm teaching right now, when I'm teaching classes, I am sharing information. I am giving out information. I was used to my students being in down dog or, tree pose, those kinds of things. I was not prepared for sitting with my students and having a longer conversation, not just answering questions or giving information, but actually running a conversation and helping that, directing those conversations so that they're beneficial for everyone in the room, myself included, because I'm always looking for what my students want next, right? So having that, I was not prepared for having conversational meetings. And I know that sounds really weird. What stemmed from that was that I wasn't sure I liked training, because when I started, I wasn't prepared for these conversations. I wasn't sure I liked it because I wasn't prepared for those conversations. And I hadn't gone through these steps. Obviously, I hadn't created these steps at that point. So everything for me felt quite disorganized. But those conversations with people, I wasn't sure at that point that I was qualified to be a trainer, because I wasn't sure I could answer each and every question they had. Over time, I've realized that I will never be able to answer each and every question. I frequently tell students, hey, I will find the answer for you, or I will look into that if I don't have an answer. But that first session, I felt very awkward doing that. So be prepared for conversation, right? Again, what's helped me is having that agenda, having those prepared materials. Again, whether you use my manual and workbook as your guide, as your materials, as what you're going to read and reference, or whether you're pulling information from some of the books that you've learned in your own trainings, those things really help creating your agenda and being prepared for the conversations that will happen in your trainings. And now I really love the conversation. I think the conversation absolutely enriches training. It enriches everyone's experience. It helps the students remain engaged. Definitely. And they all learn from one another. And then the spotlight isn't always on you as the trainer. You are sharing in this learning process with your trainees. And those conversations, 99.9% of the time, I learned something too, whether that's a new book or a new take on a posture or something. I am always learning as well. And so those conversations have come to be my favorite part of training, is letting students ask questions, letting other students answer and me answer, and all of those things. That conversation just enriches training wonderfully. So don't be afraid of it, just be prepared for it. Let's see. So this last session that I held, that I just wrapped up in last month, I rearranged. So in step 8, we're talking about preparing for your next session. And one of the big changes I made was to move a good chunk of my in-training practice sessions. This is asana, pranayama, meditation practices, moving a chunk of those to the very start of training. So we had a couple of weekends where we focused solely on the trainees' practice, where I've got something in my training called a posture lab, and it is my format, as you might suspect, for going through postures. But they're geared towards teaching the postures, being able to explain modifications and contraindications. And so what I did was I turned those around a little bit and made those posture labs during these first few sessions geared towards the student making notes and making observations about their own practice. So we might do a practice. I teach a flow sequence. That's the main type of class that I teach. And so we would go through a flow. And so we would go step by step through the sun salutations, not looking at verbiage or how to teach the sun salutations, but how to practice them. I'd always done this throughout the course of my training, but I decided that I wanted to try this up front. I had seen some programs that were running immersions as part of their yoga teacher training, and I felt it just struck a chord with me as very valuable. And I definitely will include it in future sessions because trainees, most people that come in my case, I'm a traveling yoga teacher, so I get people from all over. They come in and everybody's got a wide variety of experiences with class, with their own practice. And I wanted to use those immersions to, as best I could, get us all on the same page. So I really enjoyed those immersion sessions, but that is something that I changed drastically in my yoga teacher training sessions. So I needed to account for that in all of my agendas, in my planning from there on out. I had to move, some other modules around. There would be more time in some of these later modules because the chunk of this practice had moved up front. So I had to re-prepare in a lot of ways and move things around. So I think it's been a great addition, but it's an example of ways that I'm constantly looking to change and update and upgrade, and something that you will likely do as well. There will be things in your training, even with your plans, that don't go as well as you like, that you perhaps in the end didn't feel quite right about, that didn't seem to fit. You'll move out, you'll move in, but I wanted to let you know that I've been doing this for 8 or 9 years, and I still prepare every time. I still look at my agendas every time. I still move things around every time. But over time, it's become better because I have a basis from which to start. And that's what I'm trying to help you cut through some of that time that it takes and get right to the good stuff of having a basis from which to start. So preparing yourself as a trainer, really when you start training, you are stepping into a leadership role. And that's the biggest thing to prepare yourself for. Your trainees, your students were looking to you as a teacher, as a leader for sure. But when you are a trainer, they look to you as a leader in a different way, and you become a leader in a different way. So I think preparing yourself to step into a new leadership role, it's very exciting, it's lots of fun, but I think just preparing that and understanding that that is a thing, right, is key. So being prepared, having your agenda, having your overall training plan, having your resources to refer to, all of these things are going to just help you be prepared. Understanding that training is a conversation, as I mentioned, totally took me by surprise. And I totally stumbled that first session, or maybe two, as I got used to having that conversation. So just understanding that is also where you're headed with training, right? Is conversation with your trainees, and you're stepping into that larger leadership role. And then preparing yourself also as a trainer is keeping your eye on why your students are there. They're there to learn to teach yoga classes. It's a question I ask myself a lot when I'm preparing my materials. Will this help my students learn to teach yoga classes? Yoga is a wealth of information. If you're like me, I have a library of yoga books, and I love that. And I love that yoga is a wealth of information. But I have to really stay focused on the fact that trainees are there to learn to teach classes. not everybody will in the end, honestly. I have nurses and therapists and all sorts of people come in who don't plan to teach classes. They plan to incorporate yoga into their practice, their existing therapy practice or nursing practice. But it's my responsibility. People sign up for yoga teacher training. I've got to make sure that I stay on track with my materials and what I'm doing to teach them how to teach. At the end of the day, in their testing, in my training, I always run a test, a teaching test and a written test, and they need to be able to teach a class, right? So I got to keep my eye on why they're there. I have to give them a plan for being able to sequence classes, being able to manage their time in a class, addressing specific concerns for students, things like understanding the student-teacher relationship. So all of those things are things that are not just practicing yoga, they are really the key pieces to for them to step into a leadership role as a teacher. So I have to keep my eye on that as well. So steps 3 and 4 today. Step 3 was that next step in creating your agenda, getting down to that daily agenda. I'll post that in the comments so you have a format from which to start. And the preparing yourself in this new leadership role as a trainer. And so getting used to the differences between teaching a class and training for yoga teacher training. That is it for today. If you have questions, post in this live stream from below, and I will get to your questions and I'll post those resources for you in the comments. All right, thanks for joining today.